Hello, Book Stew viewers and listeners. I'm so happy to have an in-studio guest with me today, because if a writer's in studio, that means they live within, let's say, an hour of Wilmington, Massachusetts, and we are lucky enough today to have David Curcio in the studio with me. And David has written kind of a fascinating book. I would include it if I were to write up a curriculum for the sociology of America, maybe from the 20s to almost now. It's called Smash Hit, and you can see there's, that's Myrna Loy and two boxers on the cover, but the subtitle really tells it all. It's Race, Crime, and Culture in Boxing Films. Welcome, David.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. How did you come to become interested in the topic, write the book?
I still ask myself that question, but I believe it sort of with the spawn of a couple articles I'd written for a boxing publication, which generally covers boxing topics, but in this case, I had seen a couple of films, both Body and Soul and Kid Galahad, early film noir, and thought there was more in there to just boxing stories, and wrote these pieces. And it was sort of the germination of a larger idea, how I can link, looking through the century at major cultural events as related to boxing, crime, cinema,
and religion, really.
And religion ties into it. Well, culture being a part of the subtitle, and so I set about writing more for more of these essays, which I expanded upon the originals and wrote more of the essays to ultimately link and kind of bring the reader through the 20th century. The films themselves in the book are not necessarily in chronological order so much as how they address contemporaneous issues.
Right. So let's get right to those three areas: race, crime, and culture. So in the race arena, you've got the fact that in the beginning, these boxing films only featured white and maybe a Hispanic person or two. According to what you say in the book, there was always tension about black fighters and white fighters engaging. Isn't that true?
Certainly early on. And when I say early on, I may be speaking through the 1920s, where black fighters, blacks in general being more disenfranchised groups. I mean, nobody goes into boxing who already has some sort of income. It attracts, and for that reason, you can look at boxing as a bellwether of the most disenfranchised groups in the country. Blacks have perennially been enmeshed in the sport. Many, as they entered the game, many whites were afraid to fight them. A loss to a black would reflect poorly on the white race. It was quite, to an extent it still is, a racist country. And so I can say a lot of black actors were rejected from early films based on stories that featured black fighters and replaced by white fighters, generally due to the fact that they just might not be the draw that Hollywood, for film-going audiences, or because, studio heads could be quite racist.
And because they never considered that there would be black, that black audiences were also a group you should produce films for. I think The Great White Hope, the movie The Great White Hope, which until I read this book, it had been pushed to the back of my mind, even though I saw the play when it was in New York. You cut the discussion about Jane Alexander in the role as the white girlfriend, and James Earl Jones, who, nobody, I wouldn't say that most people, if you said James Earl Jones, they're going to say Star Wars. Or, so I thought I really appreciated that chapter, and I thought it was interesting how, as we moved along through that century, black boxers became prevalent, but there was also a small period where different ethnic groups and religious groups became the focus. You had Jewish fighters and Jewish mob bosses. You had Irish fighters. You had Italian fighters. So I thought that was very interesting. And you also did a little part about priests being involved in boxing films. And all I could think of was Carl Malden in On the Waterfront with Marlon Brando, where Marlon Brando used to be a contender, Hey Charlie, to his brother, but Carl Malden was the smoking priest, and so I really enjoyed the revisit of those tropes and how those ethnic groups passed relatively quickly.
And again, they served as a kind of to look at the various ethnic groups who dominated the sport at various times early on, Irish and English immigrants, blacks, again, throughout, pretty much were a constant, second generation Jews in the 1920s, Italians in the 1940s. It really speaks to where certain groups lay on the income scale, before sort of assimilating into the larger culture of America.
And there's really a lot of you dredge up things that, as someone who was born in 1952, I probably knew, but just really didn't think about that much. And so I don't want people to think that I'm not a fan of violence, and it's permitted outcomes like boxing and mixed martial arts. At least it's not mixed marital yet. I'm sure that'll be the next thing they think of. But coming through that lens of movies, ethnicity, and boxing, I thought you really tied it so well together. The involvement of, I still don't know if we're supposed to say mafia or the mob, and their complete control of boxing, as far as who won, who lost, who threw this fight, who got to fight in the first place.
Yeah, the mob really took control, took its chokehold on the sport in following after Prohibition was lifted and other means of income, turning to other means of income. One of which was due to the great influx of immigrants from many different parts, generally Europe, but all over. These people who looked suitable as fighters, were they had a poor grasp of the language. They had no grasp generally of financial money management, and could be easily manipulated by the mob into fighting, and ultimately, ripped off as the mob became more organized, though, and glamorized in the media.
Good point.
That's something very important. You look at something like 1931. That year, both The Public Enemy and Little Caesar had come out, and at that point, the public couldn't get enough. Hence their tie into boxing films, and their popularity within the media. They filled the headlines, and as moving throughout the 30s, the 40s, they did in the 50s. The mob retained its chokehold on the sport largely through control of the fighters and being able to their ability through threats, force, to control the entire sport, to the extent that they would have in order for Jake LaMotta is a classic example, having to take a dive in order to get a chance at usually losing a fight in one way or another, or just conforming to whatever their wishes were, their wishes being in the interest of making money, to give the fighters a shot at greater success, a title or something
and
like
a little
that.
bit of the little bit of money that they would allow them, right?
Yes. In general, not many fighters, and I mean, they were everywhere. The mob was everywhere, and they took. Well, let's just say they took their cut. We had, there were some successful fighters, a lot of whom did not end well, not necessarily due to the mob, but due to financial straits.
Well, and due to the mental issues of what is CTE and getting hit in the head.
That's exactly right.
But you did bring up Jake LaMotta, so because I would think most everyone would remember the Robert De Niro movie Raging Bull, which you bring up as really one of the, from 1980, one of the, just a basic, important movie looking at more Jake LaMotta, the horror of a man, and how Robert De Niro played him. And you have a very interesting little story at the beginning where Frank Sinatra and Pete Hamill, we know who Sinatra was, Pete Hamill was a famous newspaper writer, just happened to be somewhere together, and they were talking about the worst person who had ever lived in the entire world. And they very quickly came to the conclusion that it was Jake LaMotta, which amazed me. Because,
that was Frank Sinatra.
Yeah, because I mean, they both probably knew a lot of horrible people in their line of work. So would you do a small reading from your Raging Bull chapter, just so everyone knows there are 20 films covered in the book, and they go pretty much, and they also include some documentaries, which I thought was a good idea. But I particularly liked the Raging Bull description of that movie.
Yes, starting from the top.
Right.
Yeah. Films from 1980 and directed by Martin Scorsese. In what sounds like an academic panel on reprobates, rather than two guys drinking in a corner booth at P.J. Clark's saloon, Pete Hamill recounts a conversation with Frank Sinatra during which they fell to deliberating who the worst person in the world was. Silent moment of reflection, another round of Jack Daniels, and the verdict fell to ex-middleweight Jake LaMotta, lower than whale. The chairman hissed. Boxing writer W.C. Hines put it slightly more gingerly. Jake LaMotta will go down into the books as one of the most unpopular figures of all time. Sports writer Jimmy Cannon wrote that the fighter was probably the most despised man of his generation. Bully, thug, woman basher, sociopathic powder keg, LaMotta fit every bullet point. Martin Scorsese's Raging Bull sees a transformative Robert De Niro assimilate, masticate, and spew forth the caustic jealousy and grotesque masochism that isolated everyone within the boxer's life. At the film's premiere, LaMotta watched a hard-hitting recreation of his fraternal bond and doomed marriage systematically dismantled by the pathological jealousy of a man whose only means of expression is violence. "I don't like that person," he said upon the film's premiere. "He's a bad man, and I know he's me."
That's so there's a lot of time spent on not only Jake LaMotta himself, but on Robert De Niro's, what Robert De Niro had to do both physically and just mentally to play such a terrible person. So I know that Raging Bill, as far as you're concerned, is really one of the, maybe it was, the combination of De Niro and Scorsese have worked together so many times, and Joe Pesci is in that as well, right?
A funny anecdote about, a telling anecdote about De Niro's fidelity to the character he played, the real life character he played. He had spotted Joe Pesci on a made-for-TV movie. Joe Pesci was really a song and dance man. He'd even released an album called Little Joey Sure Can Sing at that. But Robert De Niro liked his look and talked him into being part of the film. It was years in development, but the two of them actually lived for 3 months together as in character, as brothers.
To get into the rhythm
To
of
get
what
into the rhythm.
Nobody said that Robert De Niro didn't try to emulate as much of the characters he played and absorb them into himself. Hopefully he's still a relatively normal person. The other one, the other film I really enjoyed reading about was Requiem for a Heavyweight of 1962. And there's someone who's involved in this, very deeply involved in it, the person who wrote it, who was a complete surprise to me. Would you mind doing another little reading about that?
Sure. On Requiem for a Heavyweight, directed by Ralph Nelson from 1962, and starring Anthony Quinn as a waning, washed up, brain damaged boxer at the end of his career. Penned by the 31-year-old Rod Serling for Playhouse 90, a CBS live drama that aired from 1956 to 1960, Requiem's original 1957 teleplay starred a twitchy, slurring Jack Palance. The following year, the BBC aired its own production featuring Sean Connery in his first starring television role. 4 years later, Serling adopted the multiple Emmy winner for the big screen. Best known for probing the uncanny with 156 seminal episodes of The Twilight Zone, which ran from 1959 to 1964, and 43 episodes of Night Gallery, 1969 to 1973, Serling also fought 17 bouts as a flyweight in the military. His time in the Air Force helped shape his interest in the uncanny, unexpected, and frequently morbid. Among other horrors, he witnessed a fellow soldier crushed by a box from an American supply plane. His first published work, a 4-page short story about a boxer's suicide titled The Good Right Hand, appeared in the 1948 edition of the Antioch College Literary Magazine when Serling was 23. He also wrote 2 episodes for The Twilight Zone devoted to the game, 1960's The Big Tall Wish, notable for its black cast, and 1963's Steel. He sold a more faithful adaptation of Ring Lardner's Champion to the CBS anthology series Climax in 1955, 6 years after the release of Robson's film. Professor Andrew Del Blanco describes the soul-killing loneliness of Serling's character as embodied in voyagers stranded, astronauts marooned, spouses estranged, clerks doing mind-numbing work while dreaming of a larger life. In the boxing arena, Serling's attentions lay with the uncertain futures of lesser-known fighters, or, as he wrote in his dedication to the play's novelization, the punchies, the cauliflowered wrecks, the mumbling ghosts of 8th Avenue bars. To the writer, boxing was the ultimate stage upon which hopes were dashed, victories short-lived, and participants wore the sorrow-etched face of a panhandler exchanging a fragment of dignity for a hot cup of soup. Unlike the zones of the fantastic for which he is best known, the writer considered Requiem's pathos most representative of the stories that he wished to tell. A heavy smoker and drinker, Serling died of heart complications at 50.
When I read that part and I saw Rod Serling's name, I was so shocked. I think the last thing you would ever associate him with is boxing. And yet, I remember when that movie came out, so I was little, but I can remember my parents seeing it and being completely, because was Jackie Gleason in that too, or was
Yes, Jackie Gleason and Mickey Rooney.
Yep. So I mean, it had an amazing cast and all people that you would never think of in that role. As far as you're concerned, do you feel that that's, if you have to, quantify, is that one of the best boxing movies that's ever been made?
Yes, and notably, there's just hardly any fighting in it. There's about a minute in the opening scene where, which features a young Cassius Clay as the opponent. And it's sort of shot in a POV point of view from Mountain Rivera, Anthony Quinn's character, as the blow lands, and you see, the whole camera, at an angle as he falls to the canvas.
And you talk in the book about how filming boxing was generally done from outside the ring, but some directors understood the importance of having the filming done as dangerous as it is from the inside of the ring so that the moviegoer could truly, luckily not get the physical sensation of being pounded, but could see what blows coming at you would really look like.
And this was really developed in 1955's Killer's Kiss by Stanley Kubrick, very little known, his second film, and just about an hour long. He seemed to be the first to bring the camera into the ring, and 25 years later, 25 years later, Martin, Raging Bull, took many cues from Stanley Kubrick and just took it to absolutely new extremes, particularly in that point of view shot.
So we're running a little low on time, so sure. I'm going to hit you up with 3 boxing movies that you did not include in the book.
Okay.
And, as you said, you say in your introduction that, there's reasons why you include kind of some that were obscure as well as the famous one. So I'm just going to, these popped into my head, so just give me a couple of sentences as to why you didn't include them. And my first one would be $1 Million Baby.
I saw that coming.
I knew you would.
I thought it important to discuss women, not just in boxing, but in sports in general, in combat sports, the growing popularity. There's actually just a little over a year ago with the first pay-per-view female fight. But I saw more. I could mine more from the film, the lesser-known indie film Girl Fight from 2000
and
with
that
Michelle Rodriguez.
I loved that chapter because Michelle Rodriguez, who I really loved in Lost, and that was her first film. Yeah,
that was her first acting of
and
any
she had
kind.
to learn how to box.
Yes.
It was, and she played someone who was learning how to box. So
exactly.
I definitely agree with your choice of that movie. I think that, and in fact, I'm going to see it. The second one is, so because I live in Massachusetts, but I grew up on Long Island, I'm very familiar with the 2 early Rockies, Rocky Graziano and Rocky Marciano. Mm-hmm. And there was very little mention of either one of them in the book, and especially of Somebody Up There Likes Me.
Right.
So why did you not include that one?
I just didn't see a link. It did not, I thought it was a fabulous film. I've seen it many times, but I did not see a connection. I really felt that the story was a little whitewashed.
Ah,
And
how so?
Well, Rocky Graziano was, while he wasn't Jake LaMotta, he spent time in some of the same, youth
Facilities.
rehabilitation
Okay.
facilities, and I didn't think Newman was particularly convincing.
Really? Too
Yeah.
pretty, or?
Yeah.
That's
Though a lot of, let's face it, a lot of, when you're casting in Hollywood, to the film's credit, Robert De Niro, Russell Crowe in Cinderella Man, they were somewhat better looking than the people. That's Hollywood, right? That's a biopic.
All right, here's my third one, and this one will make you laugh, I'm sure. Roll your eyes, and you're allowed. Because I just finished her Big as a Brick autobiography, Barbra Streisand's The Main Event, with Ryan O'Neal.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's a kind of a boxing movie.
Kind of a boxing movie, but not just. It just there was nowhere to fit that. Again, there was just nowhere to fit that.
Maybe
And
boxing movies that had nothing to do with boxing would be, or silly boxing movies or something.
It would be very interesting to write. That would make more of an essay, or if I could have, carved out some sort of standalone chapter on, boxing as a peripheral aspect. That could have been interesting. There are a number of Japanese films that from the 60s and 70s where that feature boxers, but really not a lot of boxing at all.
So I bet you didn't see that one coming.
I did not at all.
And it's only
at
because
all.
I just finished her book.
That is, that did catch me off guard.
Okay. All right, well, I am afraid we are out of time. So, David, I want to thank you so much for coming on to Book Stew and for writing. I love it when authors join me who are not right up my alley. The subject, I love movies, but the subject of this was when I started, was not up my alley, but somehow you're weaving in, and it's really race, crime, and culture, into your observations about the films. I think this could really be a wonderful college course or an online course. I hope, will you do anything do you ever teach, or?
I'm actually, I teach printmaking. I'm a fine art. I have an MFA. I was a fine arts major, so I just finished a semester teaching at Suffolk in printmaking. So, not quite sure how to tap into the theater department, but you're not the first to say that.
Well,
you're
I
not the
hope,
first to
you'll
mention
maybe
that.
take us up on it, because I can think of, several either, community education or, education for retired people, like Tufts has one, on, lifelong learning stuff that this would be a wonderful course.
I would love it. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on Book Stew with this really thought-provoking book that I have to recommend to everybody. I assume it's available everywhere. It came out in 2023.
Yes, I've seen it in some bookstores, but it's certainly Amazon, anywhere. It can be ordered
From the evil empire.
from the it's publishers hate it, and they recognize how necessary it is to the business. It's a difficult.
I just thought also, there's a major at UMass Amherst called Sports Management that I understand is fairly popular. I think this would also be a wonderful book to add to that course. So I'm just thinking these things
brainstorming,
out
but
loud.
it's worth doing. Absolutely.
All right, so Book Stew viewers and listeners, I know we're kind of off the track here, but I really want to recommend Smash Hit for the sociology of it, for the movies of it, and for the history of it. So thanks again, David.
It was fun. Thank you, Eileen.
Have a good night.